We know now that preventing catastrophic climate change, doing what we agreed to do in Paris in 2015, would require us to decarbonise our world at least 6 times faster than anything we've achieved so far. This year's events and the recent IPCC report are driving that message home. If we shoot past a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees, we will be living dangerously every year, and our children will look back and ask, why did you not act when you had a chance? Trouble is, we're talking about change on a scale we can barely begin to comprehend. Not simple substitutions so we can get on with life and business as usual, but profound structural change to life and business as usual. We need innovation in every sense of the word. Most of all, we need innovation that brings about a fundamental transformation of economic, social and financial systems to meet Paris targets. The global financial system plays a key role in this transformation. But so far, we've only seen gradual transitions and incremental change. For example, 60% of the world's largest pension funds have little or no strategy on climate change, and the combined investments of the 100 largest funds globally in low-carbon technologies and business models amounts to less than 1% of their funds under management, and many of them are still invested in high-carbon emitting businesses. And yet, the recent report of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate points to a direct economic gain of at least $26 trillion through to 2030 and over 65 million new jobs compared to business as usual if we act boldly now. We need to completely rewire our financial system to enable the scale and pace of change required. But reshaping the financial system or any other system requires more than one solution. It needs many different approaches, multiple innovative experiments and options working in parallel, connected and learning from one another. Using our collective intelligence, we can create the momentum to shape new solutions, business models and market structures that fully integrate climate and climate priorities into mainstream financial activities. Experimenting as an ecosystem with the world's innovators together with business leaders and industry disruptors, with citizens and farmers, with students and school children. We can work together to find multi-dimensional solutions that act on many levels. Democratizing climate risk information, creating strong financial incentives to reduce emissions, driving demand from cities and regions, rethinking market design and value economics in terms of circularity and planetary boundaries. Together, we can develop truly impactful and investable solutions. And to make this happen, we are looking for the willing, not just the winning. Join our mission.
Thank you very much. I'm Kirsten Dunlop. For those of you who have not yet met me, I'm the Chief Executive of Climate-KIC and very proud to be here representing over 350 organisations whose combined potential impact on climate change is extraordinary. Climate-KIC is funded by the European Institute of Innovation of Technology, and I'm also very proud to say that they are here as we co-shape and co-design what we are doing together. Now, we are running way behind, courtesy of the extraordinary gift of a significantly richer picture than we were assuming we may have of what the Commission is planning and thinking of doing. So I'm going to need to be quick, and at the same time, I'm going to make a choice to do something which has nothing to do with a list of projects that Climate-KIC is working on, because that is what this conference is about. You will go into breakout sessions after this that will start after I finish, that are part of a whole series of sessions where there have been opportunities and a frame for our partners and Climate-KIC together to be talking about what we're doing together. So I'm going to do something slightly different. And the hat I'm going to wear is the hat of somebody who has spanned boundaries in business, in academia, but the constant thread of that boundary spanning has been how to enable change and how to unlock and enable action. And that's what the third day of this conference is about. How do we go from looking at the rules of the game to unexpected leverage points and reframes to the question of enabling action and enabling transformation? And there are three things that I want to address in talking about that. I'm going to start with a parable. Many years ago, I've worked for 20 years in insurance, and working in a company that was at the time by the media described as Byzantine, a company called Generali, Associazioni Generali. I took the entire senior management to reflect on the question of the problem of the future, and brought into that group a man called Arie de Geus, who for many, many years worked in Shell on exactly that problem. And the parable that Arie de Geus told was a parable that he's famous for telling. It was actually a parable that comes from a man called Pierre Wack. It's a parable in which the mayor of Rotterdam receives an unexpected guest in July 1920. And that unexpected guest tells him that he can provide the mayor of Rotterdam with a precise prediction of the future. Here's Rotterdam in 1920. And the mayor says, okay, all right, come on then. And the man sits him down and says, this is what's going to happen to Rotterdam in the next 25 years with absolute certainty. A cataclysmic period following the Treaty of Versailles to the end of the Second World War, stock market crash of 1929, the rise of Nazism, the German bombardment of Rotterdam in 1940, the blocking of the port and its use for submarines, the Allied bombardment in 1943, and just before liberation, the systematic destruction of the port by German occupiers. And then the strange guest says to the mayor, now that you know what's going to happen in the next 25 years, what are you going to do about it, Mr. Mayor? And this parable has been used for years to ask people that very same question. What do you think the mayor could and would do about it? And the answer is nothing. Because what can you do with that kind of information if you aren't certain? And if you don't have alternatives? And indeed, that is precisely the problem. We've heard in these days people refer to scenarios. We now have science which is looking uncomfortably like the unexpected guest visiting the mayor of Rotterdam and saying, here is what's going to happen over the next 50 years. What are you going to do about it? And the scenarios are not so uncertain as a random unexpected visitor. They are, at this point, rather close, uncomfortably close to predictions. What's uncertain is what we are going to do about it. This is Rotterdam now, a completely erased city rebuilding itself from scratch, and actually one of the most innovative port innovations areas in the world, and we are proud to partner with them. I come from a world of dealing in business, and the implications of existential threat, the equivalent of existential threat for business, is what I have been for years calling and defining as strategic risk. This is a definition that actually came from working with Generali and subsequent financial services players across the world. It's a definition of the possibility of something happening that simply eradicates your existence or seriously damages your capability to survive. And the challenge has always been, what do we do about it? I once had an extraordinary meeting with the board of Generali in which I pointed out that the 5 billion assets of real estate in Piazza San Marco alone in Venice would be underwater by 2050. They are, in fact, already comprehensively underwater on a regular basis, including 2 weeks ago. And said to them, you know, you've got options, you've got a massive real estate portfolio, why not sell the underwater rights to Disney right now for Atlantis, underwater Atlantis in 100 years? It'll be one of the most interesting tourist destinations in the world. And they said to me, well, quite apart from the fact that we're not sure that that's a reliable prediction, we can't be known as the men who sold Venice. It'll have to be someone else, not on our watch. And there is our challenge of decision-making and action. What can we do about this particular problem? The real possibility that we face existential threats. The answer is innovation. but it is not innovation in the way in which we have been doing it. This is not innovation trusting market forces out there in the world that will pick up single-point solutions and magically glue them together and change the world we live in. This is innovation of a very, very different order. It's innovation that is systemic. It's innovation that understands that we are handling uncertainty and unpredictability, that we do not have answers, and that we're going to need to generate multiple, parallel, connected experiments. It is what I would describe as the most prudent hedge for strategic risk that we can possibly invest in. And the idea is that we're going to need a portfolio of many solutions, and we're going to need for those portfolios to generate for us pathways for decision makers to walk along, pathways to action, transformational pathways that show what's possible at scale. And that's what we are here to do. It's what these 3 days are about. It's what the Climate-KIC community is all about. How do we generate those kinds of pathways? I'm going to give you one example of what that looks like in practice. It's not a European example because I thought, let's go offshore and keep it out of the polemics of what isn't the right solution. This is Cyclone Yasi, Queensland, Australia, where one of the biggest problems is that Europeans build houses in Australia, and Europeans think that the most important thing about building a house is to make sure it stands up solidly off the ground. But for most of the eastern seaboard of Australia, the biggest problem is tying it to the ground. Because the 1 in 100-year storms that are now happening every year, if not actually every 2 or 3 times a year, are taking these houses out every year. And one of the interesting problems is construction design, and the supply chain that leads to it, and the planning laws, and the logistics, and the whole system around it. And one of the interesting small details of a critical point of failure is that most houses in Australia in this area have metal roller doors for their garages. The garage door rolls up so that you can drive your car into a very big spacious garage underneath the house, and it rolls down. One of the most reliable patterns in a cyclone is that the wind blows in the roller door, the roof comes off, and the whole house is lost. And you see, literally, as the cyclone comes in, the pathway of those houses wiped out. So let me give you an example of innovation, reframing, working on this differently. One of the projects that I have been involved in the past, actually a couple of colleagues in the room here as well, was an experiment using 4D printing to print garage doors in steel molecules that rigidify when they hit buffeting wind conditions. 4D printing is being experimented in MIT with a man called Skylar Tibbetts, and it is possible to print with the properties, to design with the properties of the material world, so that you can install a garage roller door that becomes as hard as concrete when a cyclone arrives, and simply doesn't blow in, which means the vacuum on the roof is not established, which means on the whole the roof stays on, and you look at a very different outcome. The interesting thing about that outcome is that it reduces the underlying risk profile, and therefore the damage and the loss to the insurer. Now, what it opens up is a need for a holistic solution. This is one technology solve, there are multiple others. What it requires is changes in planning laws. What it requires is changes in logistics and supply chain, and a greater understanding of councils and citizens about what it is that they're preparing for, and the purpose of a house in protecting and preventing risk in the first place. What it mostly requires is a fundamental rethink of the insurance industry business model, from a business model designed to reserve money to pay for stuff when it's broken, to a business model that prevents risk happening in the first place, and ideally reaches in to that capital to start to invest in the innovation hedges that reduce the underlying risk, both in adaptation and through mitigation, starting to intervene to lower the surface temperature of the soil, starting to intervene in the redesign of urban planning full stop. And there is the kind of systems innovation beginning to emerge that takes us towards reframes. If we think, in the context of what we've been talking about now, about the amount of capital under all of our solvency regulation that we are going to have to start putting away more and more and more of as we see storms more frequent, floods and water rises and sea surges and hailstones and bushfires more and more frequent, we're going to be locking up some of that extraordinarily important capital that we need to invest in changing the outcomes, the underlying risk. So there's a wonderful opportunity if we think about just one idea to throw in to our work on rewiring finance. How about we start to think about the timescales and pull forward the future into the present as we release capital, even just a minor percentage of risk capital, to invest in the innovation that will change the outcomes, but to invest in systemic innovation. The last thing I'm going to come to is a reframe, a connection back to something that Sean Cleary raised from us last night, which is the need for a social revolution. Business model change, economic revolution, industrial redesign, social revolution. Our biggest concern for ourselves should be ourselves. And here I want to leave you with an example which I hope should be a source of inspiration for how we create pathways around a social commitment to change over generations. If you think about the idea of using risk capital as a way of, I heard yesterday that the Indians have a wonderful expression which is preponing. Since you can postpone a meeting, you can also prepone a meeting. And actually, that's fantastic, because if you think about what we do with capital and with risk, where we essentially pay forward into a future that we know less about than the present, anything uncomfortable that we have to deal with now, could we prepone the risk that we're dealing with and release some of our risk capital to start funding the innovations that will secure a better future? This is Florence. It's the Piazza della Signoria in the center of Florence. And this is the scene of a remarkable story. This is the development of Florence from about 1150 through to about 1600. The thing you most need to know about these are the different sections of the piazza that were opened up and cleared, and the edges of the piazza built around it. There is a thing you need to understand about this, the most important source of inspiration. Florence was a city that sits at the heart of trade routes, salt routes, gold routes, textile, wool. It's one of the richest cities in the world. It has one of the foundational keystones of banking and finance across the world, and indeed of financial legislation, one of the areas of the world with the most fertile connection between commerce, the real economy and finance, and the investment of both in the notion of identity and meaning. In this city, for literally 400 years, with governments changing every 6 months, individual citizens participated in a process where they would pull down the front of their house and remove the building line back, in some cases by 14 centimeters, and rebuild it at their own cost in the architectural language stipulated by the city. And they would do that over centuries. This is a centuries-long process of rebuilding, of clearing public urban space. And in fact, this connects to an entire system around the city of streets that are straight, flat, rectangular, and have exactly identical architectural language up to the level that the human eye naturally sees as it walks along. And it connects the civic building of the government in this street piazza with the church in the anchoring piazza. What made it possible for that kind of multi-generational commitment to transforming a city at your own expense, with governments changing every 6 months? Here are electoral cycles simply not mattering. What made it possible was an anchoring narrative. Florence was determined to create itself the new Rome, and in particular the new Republican Rome, which later the Medici used and turned into the natural evolution of a republic into having a ruling family. But the thing that most mattered to them was to evoke physically, materially, symbolically, and practically everything that came with the rule of law, of common good in particular, over private interest, of the combination of the balance of the power of the church, and in this case the state, of the possibility of aggregating resources, and of shaping the future by creating economic conditions for stability and prosperity that would put Florence in the heart of tax routes and the possibility of taxing the goods coming through. And there was a deliberate evocation of the physical structure of the city and the political, civic code of Republican Rome linked to economic prosperity and financial might. And that was designed into the fabric of the city with a narrative so strong that it survived multiple generational changes and multiple political changes and an ongoing commitment. And for me, I think there is an inspirational, and a source of inspiration for us to try and reconnect to. How can we create the kinds of narratives, the kinds of enabling stories for ourselves to allow for that kind of intergenerational commitment? If we think, and then at this point I'm going to take that towards this notion of innovation fundamentally serves the purpose of changing ourselves. It's about changing a business model, a business identity, a business self to make it more future fit, more resilient and capable of adapting and surviving. If you think that corporations were created to limit liability, think about cities in a context of climate change and regions. These are the places where we are already aggregating demand, forcing and structuring and making markets, where more or less all of the emissions concentration in terms of market pull are increasingly concentrated. Think of cities as the corporations of the future, and then think about liability and responsibility. Think about asbestos cases. Imagine in 30 years, when our children are handling a set of circumstances that we haven't even begun to experience, and start asking themselves, looking back 30 years before, in 2020 and 25 and 30, those generations knew what was going to happen. They knew they had the resources, and they knew it was a question of decision and pathway and self-transformation, and they didn't act. And they are going to put us on the stand for liability and responsibility for the choices we are making now. Which is why I want to end with an invocation of the Welsh law of generations. We've talked here about intergenerational innovation. Let's open up that into intergenerational responsibility and design, and think about how could we take the parable of Rotterdam, the mechanics and the tools of systems innovation, and the context of the examples that give us a pathway for how to narrate a narrative strong enough to hold us together, because it's about the identity that we want to choose for ourselves, and turn that into something that allows us to act proportionally to the challenge we face, i.e., act as if it were the 1930s and we were about to go to war. Mariana Mazzucato said on Tuesday, we don't ask whether we can afford it to go when we have to go to war, we just go to war. And we organize the technologies and the economic redesign around it. So if we were to prepone our situation, act as if it were the 1930s, prepare to make the kind of dramatic changes we need to make. And in this case, when we come to talk about finance, the key enabler for everything that we are able to do in our allocation of resources and our matching of decisions now against the future, design our financial system to be proportional to the challenge. For Climate-KIC, that is MissionFinance. The instrument that the Climate-KIC community wields is innovation. And what we are seeking to do here, inviting you to join us, is to work on that in a way that's proportional to the challenge, and to do so through systems innovation. Thank you very much. What follows from me is 2 breakout sessions. One of them is on landscape finance in the Dolphin Tank session main room here. And the other one, which is investing in impact, scalable, citizen-centered business models from Helsinki, is in the Podel room. Thank you very much.